thank the organizers for this conference, and I can't believe you guys are still here. So I'll be short. I think this session is just getting good. And I think the various knives and daggers that my predecessors have been exploiting, I'm going to hopefully try to go for the jugglers late, and I'm going to just be a little bit more brutal probably in my articulations than I normally would. But, why not? In the last decade, global history has emerged as a new historical category, but how global history is to be researched and taught is far from clear, and will be a significant question in the coming decades. So there is a future in it, of sorts. Now, the urgency is driven to some degree by accreditation board, which says we have to teach this stuff now in our studios. Art historical positions are on the rise that ask for expertise in global history. Now, all of this might seem positive, and as historians, we should be sort of thankful that finally, in some sense, right, a new historical consciousness is awakening and surrounding us and pushing us forward in our world. I would argue, however, that, globally speaking, the emergence of an interest in global history is not only not a global phenomenon, but countermanded by the rise of cultural nationalism, an issue that is rarely addressed in art and architectural history, and I think for good reason. It's sort of the underlying embarrassment. Cultural nationalism is particularly strong in Asia and Africa, but is also in Europe and America. Basically, cultural nationalism is a global. Now, while many of us are focused on the elephant in the room, sort of globalization, we have not yet really addressed the presence of the other elephant, cultural nationalism, and often when we fight globalization, we often wind up in the warm embrace of cultural nationalism, which is exactly not where we want to be. Cultural nationalism produces a type of historical reflection that is insistently nation-based and sometimes sort of local-based, and this is reflected in the contemporary history and in curatorial practices. In other words, to say it bluntly, given that I've only a few minutes, like everybody else here, cultural nationalism does not happen out there, so to speak. It is a silent partner to some of our historical and institutional practices, especially in the so-called West and non-West world. Cultural nationalism is, of course, an offshoot of Romantic nationalism that played a huge part in shaping national identities in the European world in the 19th century and lasted well up in the early 20th century and still exists now in this sort of new expanded form. I don't have time to delve too deeply into the historical formation of cultural nationalism, but just sort of position it there, and then hopefully we can move on. But you can sort of see it at play. When I show this building in my survey class, the answer is not Ur, Ziggurat, the Sumerians, but Saddam Hussein, 1980, and modernity. So, and the examples of reconstructed buildings in the name of national pride now has become sort of a global, hut and seek. The Cathedral of the Christ the Savior Moscow, built in 1860, demolished in 31, rebuilt in 1996 in the name of national identity. Or the Koreans just rebuilt a gate that was demolished by the Japanese in the name of national pride. And I mean, you could see the Korean language up there, which I've been just told, basically says, Korea, the great nation united, floating on the balloons of it, and so on. Both Romantic nationalism and cultural nationalism work against the illusion of certain modernization projects. It was the French Enlightenment for the Romantics, Napoleon, who wanted to give everybody, these rule of law, and it was the Cold War divisions and other forms of modernization for the cultural nationalisms, and more specifically than Americanism and ethnic blunting or ethnic sort of hybridity. So in other words, both nationalism and cultural nationalism have this sort of anxiety about certain formations that they play up in order to sort of promote themselves. Now, a critical player in this was our good friends from the UNESCO with their World Heritage List created in '75, which radically escalated the amount of buildings that were salvaged, repaired, rebuilt, redesigned, moved, whatever, all in the name of sort of preservation. The consequence was that the architecture that held a small place in the curatorialized world, for more than a century, is now increasingly enlarged. So this is just their website proudly talking about all the buildings, and you can go and click on all the buildings. The principal theme that they use, of course, is the outstanding universal value, which adds sort of this idea of metaphysical permanence to these buildings, right? They will be there forever, and 5,000 years from now, God, forbid, they'll still be there. Now, cultural nationalism has placed a premium on architecture. And basically this architectural world that we see today as one that is tradition, that is completely sort of revamped our whole notion of the role between architecture and the arts. Right. So this is a chart of the curatorialized space. And you see, architecture is sort of bumping along there until basically relatively recently, and now it's just off the charts. I mean, I just gave up, just somewhere up there, You only hope that maybe it's going to level off, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I see no end in sight. It's just going to keep on zooming up there. Another chart, for your entertainment here. So in other words, if painting and we have architecture, and if we just sort of say roughly painting and architecture were more or less alike in 1950 or 60, actually it could be the same almost for 1960 or 65. The amount of paintings that we've salvaged and protect are times 100. The amount of building space, territorial space, is more like times 1,000,000. And of course, it's always a beautiful story that is being told. It's a picture perfect. So this is part of the pathology of the preservation world, is that it inherits the romantic notion of architecture as a picture perfect environment. That is sort of, and you can go now to the new website. I don't know, Lucia, I'm sure you know about this, is the Download Heritage site, direct to your iPad. And you can do that, and you can go to the 755 sites, and you can download all the pictures. No rain, no snow, no ugly people in the corners, no beggars, no pickpockets, no whatever. It's all, God, beautiful, polished, and great, right? So, there's an example of the, what the type of stuff that you can download. Okay. Now, cultural nationalism has placed such a premium on architecture and therefore on a history of architecture, right, that it has sort of transformed what we understand by history and tradition in a very serious way. Okay. So, and this transformation brings us to the heart of a philosophical problem that we really need to address. So, in other words, in traditional 19th century aesthetics, we started with poetry, we had painting, sculpture, architecture was at the bottom. I mean, this is, Hegel's argument, and basically everybody believed him up until today. This is, when you go to art history program, architecture is, usually, architectural history is usually the bottom of the offerings. But I'm sorry to tell my art historians, I'm sorry, the world has changed. Today it's all about architecture. There's a vernacularist boom. Okay, that's up there too. There's a lot of contemporary art, market-driven stuff, and then there's some pop music. That's the new sort of Hegel. I mean, if we were Hegel today, this is how we would sort of describe the seniorities of the world. So in some sense, architecture has zoomed in the last 30 years or even less, right, basically to the top of the structure of the arts. So if we have a art program, basically, today we should say, it should all be about architecture, then we should teach architectural tourism and vernacularism, then we should have maybe a course on contemporary pop art, and then maybe something on pop music. Hegel basically is finally dead. So in other words, a strange thing has happened. I mean, we really haven't noticed this phenomenon. And, right, it impacts not just simply the discipline of architectural history, right, but it impacts the fundamental philosophical premise on which the history is sort of functioning. And, to just point out how incredibly straightforward that argument is, right? I mean, you just click on India. This is literally, yesterday, boom, India, right? And you're going to get the map of India, and you're going to get a Taj Mahal. Right. And, you click on Russia, and you're going to get, the predictable buildings, all UNESCO salvaged and, funded and repaired, these World Heritage sites. Right, I clicked, of course, when you click in the United States, you get maps of the United States and pictures of dollar bills, probably about 100 pages. I mean, so the United States doesn't really work. I tried my best, but they're not out. They're not. Don't think that they're above all of this. I mean, on the contrary, right? They're, it's just they're embedded in this as well. It's just that it's, they got more dollar bills. All right. Here we have, Cambodia, and these beautiful pictures of UNESCO sites. Right. So there's been also, of course, this sort of, odd sort of desire to sort of outdo each other in these sites. And Italy, of course, is now in front. And basically, the latest, news out of Italy is that we're going to have to stop, UNESCO-ification has got to stop there because it's sort of embarrassing. So they sort of won't be UNESCO'd for a while anymore, sites, until, other places in the world sort of develop. So it's not just, that these sites are there, but the reason architecture is so successful, one of the reasons it's successful, is that it works very well at the huge scale of geopolitics. So, when President Obama visited with his wife in India, he landed at the airport and was taken straight to Humayun's tomb, which was built in 1570, but more importantly, what had just been inscribed into the World Heritage List. And it was in front of this tomb, with its imposing dome and extensive gardens, all laboriously restored, that the Obamas were received by the Prime Minister and his wife. Previous state visits by the United States President, you went to the Congress Hall or you went to a reception in some sort of government building. So this just sort of shows already how, in some sense now, these UNESCO sites are folded into the sort of the drama of a national identity. Here's some pictures of him, being taken around, and there's some more pictures of him. But even better. All right. So, in some sense, if we look at sort of romantic nationalism in the good old days of the 19th century, the terminology might have been something a little bit like this. But, as this gets replaced by cultural nationalism, we know that it's really a complicated thing, right? The struggle against modernization is really a fake struggle. In fact, cultural nationalism is all embedded in some sense, sort of the sort of agencies of culture, of modernization and modernity, and is basically complicit with it, even though you wouldn't know it from the type of discourses that are still sort of romantically imposed against it, which have to do with civilization and humanism and the strategic significance of the historical past. Now, just to focus perhaps on one small problem is the misfit between the nation state and the pre-modern history. This is sort of not addressed in really a lot of art history, but in fact almost reinforced by much art historical production. So, we'll have the classic books. If you want to study something on Armenian architecture, you get a book called Armenian Architecture. If you want to study Iranian architecture, you get a book called Iranian Architecture. You want to study a book on Indian architecture, it just goes on and on, right? There are other books, of course, but I'm sort of picking out a little bit here the weakest ones. But nonetheless, they're the ones that are being produced at a rapid pace, precisely, right, in the context of this sort of culture. It's sort of a little bit like we have to imagine, in the 19th century when, you had perspective. You looked out the window and you saw perspective. You couldn't imagine that there would be a different worldview. Well, a lot of this is sort of the same thing. Cultural nationalism, we look out the window and we think that that's the world, right? And in some sense, the world is being produced. And what we have to do is we have to imagine a very different world where, all of this is something wrong, right? We have to say stop, right? And then what do we stop? Where do we stop? So in the old days, this was sort of how, and this is how I was taught, right? We did, Egypt to Europe and the US, and then if you wanted to do something other, you went to a scholar because they knew something about all that other stuff, right? And, today we have I call it the Euro Plus model, which is, of course, just terrible. But we've replaced it, with something equally terrible, which is, the book on India, the book on US, the book on Brazil, the book on blah, 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 right? Right, and then, to make matters worse, in the last years, 48 countries have joined the United Nations since 1975, and each is eager to define its unique identity. But whereas the mid-19th century national identity was usually associated with modernization, engineering, recent national identity movements have increasingly been associated with history, religion, culture, and later sanitized for internal consumption and touristic commercialization and political empowerment. The result has been an internationalized spread of cultural nationalism and the exaltation of the discipline of tradition, and the number of national museums of the world over has multiplied dramatically. And so these are just a list of, I mean, just not even all the lists, but just sort of a list of, all the national museums that are being built in the last 20 years. It's a staggering list, and just when we know, some of the people who are embedded in that. Right. And of course, all these national museums need their curators, and all the curators need their research, right? And they need to sort of identify themselves, self-identify themselves as doing the work, of course, of making sure you understand, what the National Museum of Mexico, the National Museum of the United States, the National Museum of Qatar sort of is. All right. So we have here this sort of complicity between the national, art history projects and the National Museum project. And then you add to that the World Heritage Project. So this misfit produces several sort of rifts in how we understand our own disciplinary productions. And particularly one noticeable that is particularly onerous is the difference between sort of modern and the traditional. And just to give you an example how pervasive this is, and we don't even sort of notice it, right? This is a book on Islamic architecture, and you see it ends in 1839, right? In other words, modernism is just always seen as like at the end of history, right? Historians end with modernism because, well, there's no history with modernism, right? So I'm an historian, so when we get to modernism, it's for somebody else, right? So, I mean, this is sort of the problem. And it's institutionalized, right? This is the Leum in Korea. And, Botha did a building there called the Museum of Traditional Art. Nouvel did a Museum of Modern Art, right? Two buildings, two different institutions, two different worlds, two different architects. I mean, you can't get more diagrammatic than this sort of type of structure, right? And then you go to the website. Perhaps you can't read it too well, but, on one side it talks about the exhibition of modern and contemporary art. And then you read a little bit closer, and you see, it says permanent exhibition of traditional art. And the modern art, as you see, they use the word flow. Right? I learned something, So, modern art is about flow, and traditional art is about permanence, right? And, you would go, well, there's the rupture again, right? The idea that somehow modernism was really bad. It came in and stopped all the tradition from happening, and now all we're doing, we're stuck with a flow, right? And so, we get with this sort of equation with traditional as permanent and modern art and contemporary art all about flow and forever flowing. But the point is, as any historian knows, is exactly the opposite. Traditional art is all about flow, right? And modern, the world, is about permanence, right? UNESCO is as permanent as it's going to get. UNESCO wants the metaphysics of permanence more than anything, right? So this complete reversal of the inner logic of our own culture at play in these institutions is what is so upsetting about it, right? So we are in serious trouble, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know, my Harvard colleagues a little nervous here. All right, so this is a course you're going to could take at Harvard, off the website this spring, All sounds pretty reasonable if you wanted to study Japanese art, but please notice, whoops, I didn't get my little arrows in there, right? It starts from the prehistorical period, why not, to the 19th century. What happened to the 20th century? The idea that somehow you can go from the prehistorical to the 19th century and really not, there's no problem, it's all, And then comes the 19th century, we know, oh God, there comes the Magi, there come all modernization, that's for somebody else to deal with, right? And then read on, the primary focus will be on painting, sculpture, and architecture, right? Hegel is just, this is great. Right? So once again, right, the romantic notion, right, that the painting is at the top, architecture is the bottom, right? Art history has just swallowed basically a certain type of nationalist perspectives that are just really quite devious. And then, of course, if you want to do architecture, you got to take another course called Japanese architecture from the mid-19th century to the present, right? And of course, here you see there's no reference to painting and sculpture because architecture has been liberated by modernity, right? It's part of that flow, right? So it doesn't need a contact with anything, right? So you wish a little bit, well, what happened to the painting and sculpture for? I don't know, So I think we're, in a weird place, historically speaking, at the current moment. So if we have, these sort of piles, which are the National Art History Project, the National Museum Project, and all that with institutionalization, the World Heritage Project, the Traditional Art Project, all of these piling up in each of these individual things. And where does that leave us if we want to sort of study global architecture? Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm not particularly optimistic about the future. So what I've tried to present is that historical research is a complete lack of faith in the future of this discipline. If I know one thing, is that all of this does not equal global. The future has to be positioned against the anti-global turn in the realpolitik of our age and of our historical constructions. We have to figure out, as constructions, how to maintain leverage as our own critical practice in the world that is completely, I think, immersed in this sort of phenomenon. Thank you.